Chapter 9 of Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain focuses on a single drawing task rather than a drawing concept. This chapter covers how to draw a profile portrait. Betty Edwards explains that the exercise of learning how to draw a profile portrait accomplishes 4 goals. First, drawing profiles is a good way to access the right hemisphere of the brain because that part of the brain specializes in recognizing human likenesses. Second, trying to draw a face will give you extra practice in perceiving edges, spaces, angles, and proportions. If you fail to get any one of these right, your portrait won't look right. Third, drawing a portrait is a great way to practice bypassing habits of drawing symbols for what you see rather than what your eye is actually perceiving. Fourth, gaining the ability to draw a recognizable portrait will help prove to yourself that you actually have innate drawing capability, despite what the left side of your brain might tell you. Now, the chapter covers some of the common pitfalls that we encounter when trying to draw a human head, most of which have to do with proportions. Miss Edwards notes that we tend to emphasize features such as eyes, noses, and mouths, and then make them disproportionately larger in comparison to the other parts of the head. She tells us that when we carefully look at the proportions of the human head and measure the relative sizes of different features, we are likely to be surprised how relatively small the eye and the mouth really are. Miss Edwards also lays out some basic proportions that all normal heads have that will help avoid drawing a head that looks misshapen or scrunched. The first exercise for this chapter tries to reinforce the basic proportions of a head in profile by having you draw those proportions from a very straightforward diagram. There are no mysteries about shading or anything like that, but yet even so, my first steps here trying to draw an eye, I had to erase and restart several times to try and get that right. And as I went through this, I found that even though there were warnings about not making the eye too big, not making the mouth too big, I still ended up making the eye a little bit bigger than it actually was on the diagram. This exercise also helps to reinforce just how important small differences in spacing and angle and shape can be in what a face looks like. If you get the angles just a little bit altered, the whole look of a face can look drastically different from what you're trying to draw. Things like ears, the shapes of them are not something you're familiar with, and so in a way they're easier to draw, I guess I would say, because it's not like you have a standard model in your head for the shape of an ear, other than maybe a really cartoonish round shape. Lips are another tricky thing because, as it says in the book, a lip is not distinctly defined on the face. There's sort of a gradual gradation between where the lip starts and where the other parts of the face sort of blend into the lip. And so it's not like there's this hard border between where a lip stops and where the rest of the face picks up. And as you can see here, I'm trying to get the shape of the head right, and it just looks so malformed. I tried several times to get the curve right, and I still ended up with a head that's kind of flattened on top. And the space between the eye and the nose just didn't seem quite right. I think I got it a little bit too wide, but that was instructive just to see that getting that distance wrong really makes a big difference. So I ended up with a kind of close facsimile of what was on the example page, but the more important thing here was just to try and drill into your mind some of these basic shape spaces and proportions, that the distance from the eye to the bottom of the chin and the distance from the eye to the top of the head are equal, and that the back of the ear is the same distance from the back of the eye as the back of the eye is to the bottom of the chin. So a lot of these proportions that you never think about really get reinforced as you try to focus on them carefully. And the book is really helpful in guiding you step by step through observing each of these things and recreating them. And the second part of this first exercise is to measure these proportions on a real person, just to confirm that these basic measurements are the same. And sure enough, they are. The next exercise gets a little more serious. You try to copy a drawing that John Singer Sargent drew of a woman who apparently was known for her beauty in her day. And I just have to say, I love these types of exercises, not because I'm really good at them or anything, but because they really help me appreciate just how good professional artists are, how great the great artists really are at what they do, and how it takes real skill to duplicate what they do. And at the same time, when you try to do these things, it gives you a little bit of hope that even as a rank beginner, you can somewhat approximate some of their simpler works if you really apply these principles and work carefully and practice, that it's not just something you're born with, that maybe you can start to approach the level of skill that some of these greats had. And it's just a lot of fun at the end to compare your attempt with the masterpiece on the other side. So looking at the actual exercise, you start with the crosshairs. I clipped my viewfinder over the picture because I ended up flipping back and forth a lot, because again, Miss Edwards gives you a lot of step-by-step instructions on how to go about this, and so I find myself looking back at the instructions and then flipping back to the actual exercise. And I'm cutting out a lot of the erasing and redrawing that I do throughout here because I can never seem to get these things right on the first try. But you start with your basic unit, which I chose to be where the nose sort of meets the face and the tip of the nose, and then tried to work off of that as a basic unit for all other measurements in the drawing. And this is helpful to have a line drawing to copy from. You're not trying to draw from life yet. You're trying to reproduce lines that were already on the other paper. So it's not like you're taking a three-dimensional form and reducing it into a two-dimensional line drawing. You've got a line drawing to start with. And so this helps you to focus more on the shapes and the proportions and the measurements again. But the final result is more aesthetically pleasing. Now, this one I think I did a better job of keeping the eyes and the mouth, the ear, a little bit more correctly sized compared to the rest of the head. And this was my first practice in trying to draw some shapes that indicate where the hair is on the head, which is kind of tricky. The book says to be sure not to draw just individual hairs most of the time. You're trying to just give a suggestion of the shape that the hair makes, rather than drawing individual strands of hair, which will never work out. And finally, you just try to erase your crosshairs and sign and date it, and apologize to the original artist. Now, the third exercise is where things really get serious. You're supposed to actually draw a profile portrait of a real person from life. And this is intimidating and scary, and so I asked my lovely patient wife to be my model, because I am hopeful that she will forgive me for my terrible attempt to draw her likeness. The instruction book says to have the person sit in profile in front of you, and then to prop up your drawing paper on a board on your lap, and then draw that way, and ideally have a couple of sittings. But, we're busy. My wife has got a lot of things to do and didn't have time to sit and pose for me for an hour or two, and I always take longer on these exercises than the book says I should take anyway. So I took a picture of her with an iPad and then just used that and drew from that. I don't know if that's cheating or not, but I guess they can dock my grade if they think that that's not appropriate. I started with the smaller drawing area because I wanted it to be the same size and the same proportions as the iPad screen. So I did my best to reduce down the drawing area to match exactly with the iPad, because I really wanted to try and get the sizes correct, and I was worried that if I was trying to reduce or increase the size from what was indicated on the iPad screen that I would really mess it up. It turns out I messed it up anyway, but I feel like this helped me avoid some of the errors. Now, since you're drawing from life and you're going to try to put in shade and highlight, the book recommends that you start with a ground, somewhat soft ground, and so I did that with the graphite stick and prepared that in the normal way. And then the book is really good at holding your hand and walking you through this, again, step by step, so that you don't feel overwhelmed. The book later says that you can really start from any particular spot. You can choose whatever basic unit makes the most sense to you and just work your way through the picture in whatever way makes sense to you as you're perceiving the image. But as a beginner and as someone who's never drawn a portrait of anyone from real life, it was really nice to have those steps to start with one feature and move on to the next, and then just go step by step through it with those reminders throughout to draw negative spaces, to focus on angles and shapes and not talk to yourself too much about what it is you're drawing, but just to perceive and draw shapes and then reflect the shadows. Now, I feel like when it comes to the shadows that I did a pretty poor job here. I didn't shade in a very sophisticated way, and then I didn't erase enough highlights to really reflect. And then also just the shape of the head. You can see there's just something not quite right about it. It's flat on the top. So in the end, this is recognizable as a person, but not necessarily the person that I was trying to draw. And I'm sure any of you watching this could do a better job. I could probably have spent more time going back and revising the different spacings and proportions to get it right, but I was eager to sort of move on and just start with a fresh exercise. And that final exercise is really a come down in terms of complexity. It's to draw an American flag in some shape other than just laid out flat on a table. The only flag that I could get my hands on was a small kind of stiff flag on a little stick, and the only way I could really get it to take a shape other than just a normal flat rectangle was to sort of twist it and then lay it down on the table to get a sort of spiral effect for the flag, just to give me something more complex to draw the way that the exercise was designed. Now the basic unit here was the top of the field of stars, and I started with that and then just moved around the outside. And again, this is something where the book takes you step by step with the different parts that you're supposed to draw. And the key for this exercise to me was to reinforce how small alterations in the spacing between different parts add up to big alterations and ultimately can be big mistakes. This flag has 13 stripes, and if you get the spacing of the stripes a little bit off, when you multiply that misalignment or that wrong spacing over 13 stripes, it adds up to quite a big mistake by the end. The stars also were something that was kind of fun to figure out because they don't look symmetrical. They're not symmetrical when you look at them as they appear to your eye from an angle and being kind of curled up the way they were. But if you try to draw them symmetrical and like you imagine them in your mind, they won't look right. They still don't look quite right. But I was again trying to draw this with some shading, and I'm really grateful that the next chapter talks about shading because I really need to work on that. So overall, I feel like this chapter showed me that I have learned some stuff, but I've got a long ways to go. I wish you all luck as you work on these exercises. Take care.